Good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Levine, and I'm a facilitator here at PRUDE, and I want to welcome you to our ongoing Black History Month speaker series. So this series is a series of free interactive talks online talks by presenters from around the province who will share stories on many subjects related to Black history here in New Brunswick and the present day Black community. This includes talks on subjects ranging from Black Loyalists and Black refugees, famous Black firsts in New Brunswick, to entrepreneurship, personal uplift, and even poetry reading. So today's presenter, we want to welcome him back. He was here on Wednesdays. We want to welcome back today's presenter. He has a research specialty that works out quite well for us, and that research specialty is Black Loyalists. He is a contributor to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, the author of Birchtown and the Black Loyalist Experience from 1775 to the present, which is an illustrated book telling the story of Nova Scotia's Black Loyalists and the Birchtown settlement. He is also the author of Black Loyalists in New Brunswick, The Lives of 8 African Americans in Colonial New Brunswick from 1783 to 1834. We're going to be speaking about that book today. So we're honored to carry on a conversation that we started with him on Wednesday. Today he'll tell us about 3 Black Loyalists who decided to leave New Brunswick because of the pervasive racism of the time and make a home in Sierra Leone. So without further ado, it is my honor to welcome Mr. Stephen Davidson. And Stephen is going to start off answering some questions that came in after his last talk on Wednesday. Welcome, Stephen. How are you?
Hi, David. Yeah, I'm more than happy to continue the talk. We got a question from Jennifer asking about Jack Patterson and John Patterson. When I first came across the story of John Patterson, his name was in the Book of Negroes as a teenager, and he was known as Jack at that time. Well, of course, Jack is a nickname for John. And when I came to write the book, I realized that in most documents, that was how Jack Patterson was referred to. So I decided, okay, just to reduce confusion, I was going to address him by his full name, which would have been John Patterson. So this happens in research. For example, with the story of Pompey and Cairo, we had one handwritten will, and it seemed that his last name was Rumney. But then when I found the christening records in Gagetown that were written over a period of time, and the last name was written a number of times, it was Rumsey with an S. And you realize, someone misread the handwriting the first time, and the christening records provided the correct spelling. So it's just one of the aspects of researching in this period. No matter who is writing names down, spelling could vary, and you try to go with the best rendering of a name and the most common usage. So thanks, Jennifer, because that's points out something in historical research. Aaliyah asked a question, wondering if Pompey Rumsey actually received any sort of gift. And sadly, the answer is no. Pompey Rumsey, you may remember from our last interview, was in the employ of Sir Guy Carleton. And he was the British commander-in-chief for all of the British forces in North America in 1783. So he was, the most prominent British official in New York City at the time. And that's just who Pompey Rumsey happened to work for at the time. All that Pompey received from Sir Guy Carleton that the records show is that he was given a passport that allowed him to travel to New Brunswick with his enslaved wife. Now, if Aaliyah's question was actually wondering about Cairo, Cairo is mentioned in her enslaver's last will and testament. His name was James Peters, and he had an estate just outside of Gagetown. And when James Peters wrote up his will, he did set a male slave free, but he didn't do that for Cairo. In fact, all that he offers Cairo is his best intentions. And I'm reading from the will now. He said, "It is my will that she be kindly treated and provided with every necessary that may contribute to render her comfortable and happy in her declining years. Now, why he didn't think that she'd like to be free, I don't know. But that's as good as Cairo got in James Peters' will. And her husband Pompey, the best that the records show is that he was given permission to follow his enslaved wife to New Brunswick. So those are the answers that I was able to find for those good questions. Now we're going to talk today, Damon, about why it was that some Black Loyalists left New Brunswick, and for 8 years after their arrival, they were constantly striving to be treated as equals, which is what they've been promised. They've been promised land, just like all the other Loyalists when they came to New Brunswick. But they continued to run into frustrations. They didn't get the land that they wanted. They petitioned for schools. Those didn't come. They wanted the same rights as any British citizen, which would mean access to the courts, trial by jury, the right to vote. And all of those appeals were dismissed by the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Carleton, the first Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. And it was his opinion that, they were given their freedom and they should be happy with that. So, it was very frustrating for the Black Loyalists that had made their homes in New Brunswick. They very much wanted to be treated as citizens of the British Empire. And the man that spearheaded that was a man known as Thomas Peters. And we have a picture here. We're not 100% sure that this is Thomas Peters. Some people say yes, it is. Others say no, that this is a portrait of an actor at the time period. I'm really hoping that it is his portrait. If it is, it would have been done when Thomas Peters went to England to get a better deal for New Brunswick's Black Loyalists. So I'll start with his story. Thomas Peters was a sergeant in a unit known as the Black Pioneers. And a pioneer in military lingo is a soldier who clears lands, digs latrines, looks after other engineering duties, rather than being part of the actual fighting. So the Black Pioneers would accompany British regiments and look after some of those pioneering tasks. Now, Peters was obviously close to battle. He was wounded twice during the Revolution, and he was a commander of others, being a sergeant. So he was a leader, and he was involved in the Revolution. When it comes around to November of 1783, Thomas is among the last of those to get on a ship headed for Nova Scotia. Trouble is, it was hurricane season, and they end up being blown to Bermuda, and they don't arrive in Nova Scotia until the spring of 1784. And when Thomas Peters arrives in Annapolis Royal, he comes to a community of Black Loyalists that is very frustrated. They've only received 1 acre lots. And, white Loyalists were receiving much more than that, up to 100 acres. And the white Loyalists were being provided with food and provisions for several years. And the Black Loyalists were being told, no, we're only going to provide you with food and provision for 80 days, and then you're going to have to work. As far as I know, this is the only place where this happened, was in the Annapolis Royal area. It did not happen in New Brunswick, but obviously very frustrating. So finally, Thomas Peters and 15 families who were part of the Black Pioneer Unit go across the Bay of Fundy, and they move to New Brunswick. And just to show you how determined a man he was, within 3 months, he's petitioning the New Brunswick government for better conditions for Black Loyalists. In fact, he writes 5 petitions over the next 5 years. He was given the power of attorney by the Black Loyalist community in New Brunswick to act on their behalf. So he, in fact, becomes the first political leader of New Brunswick Black Loyalists. For all his efforts, working the system, sending petitions to the lieutenant governor, etc., nothing happens. And so he decides, okay, I'm going to go to the top. And he heads off for the United Kingdom to represent 100 families in New Brunswick and about 102 people in Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia. Thomas Peters is 52 years old when he does this, and in heading off across the Atlantic, he risks being captured and re-enslaved, but he does this, gets to England and meets up with abolitionists, meets up with British government officials, and they're horrified at what they hear, the treatment that the Black Loyalists have received in both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And in fact, both lieutenant governors for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia get their knuckles rapped by British government officials. They are very disappointed with how Black Loyalists were treated. And so what happens is Thomas Peters comes back to New Brunswick with amazing news. The British government is willing to provide shipping to transport anyone willing to go to Sierra Leone to found a colony. The British government's very particular. They want free Black Christians to populate Sierra Leone, and they have to be debt-free. They can't be indentured servants. They can't be slaves. They anticipate that it's going to be, a few score families, people that Thomas Peters knows, and they're overwhelmed. Their agent is a man named John Clarkson, and he goes to Halifax to oversee the exodus to Sierra Leone. Thomas Peters, meanwhile, heads up the St. John River, starts to tell people about the opportunity. He also goes to Annapolis Royal, lets people know there. And it turns out that almost 1,200 people want to head to Sierra Leone. And of that number, just over 200 are from New Brunswick. So the New Brunswickers head downriver. They arrive in St. John. They board ships in the fall of 1791, and they head off to Halifax. They spend November and December in Halifax waiting for the fleet to be assembled, because it takes a while to get 15 ships together to go to Sierra Leone. And by February of 1792, Thomas Peters and the Black Loyalists of New Brunswick and those from Nova Scotia are settled in Freetown. And what happens when they get there is intense disappointment, because the lots have not been prepared for them. They find out that it is not going to be a Black democracy, that in fact the Sierra Leone Company, a merchant company, is going to be in control of the colony. And this is very frustrating. They were told that their land would be free, and that instead they're going to have to pay rent. And the fact that they're not going to govern themselves is especially difficult. So again, Thomas Peters circulates petitions trying to make changes in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Tensions run high. At one point, the trust between Thomas Peters and John Clarkson is damaged because of the tension, and understandably. But sadly, this man with so much initiative and so much desire to see a better life for Black Loyalists dies of malaria in June of 1792. So he arrives in Sierra Leone in February, and he dies by June of 1792. So a lost leader for the people of Sierra Leone. He's gone on, though, to be recognized in Sierra Leone. There is a statue that's been erected in Thomas Peters' honor, and there's a street named for him. So he has not been forgotten in Sierra Leone. And of the 8 people that are featured in the book, he is the one that is known most widely. Thomas Peters has his biography in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and is when it comes to the story of Black Loyalists in general in Canada, Thomas Peters' name is the one that is most prominent. So he intersected with New Brunswick's history for 8 years, but obviously had an impact in other places as well. Now, we only know the names of a few people that went to Sierra Leone. There were about 222 people who left New Brunswick for Sierra Leone. And the reason for that is we do not have lists of passengers. There never was a complete list made of all of those heading for Sierra Leone. one of the stories that I was able to find is the story of Zimri Armstrong. And his story is unique because it's based on a document that he dictated. So much of the story of Black Loyalists depends on documentation that was maintained by colonial officials, by British officials, and we don't have the voice of Black Loyalists in many of the documents. However, with Zimri Armstrong, he actually addressed a petition to the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, Thomas Carleton, because he had a complaint against the Loyalists. So where other petitions that you can find in the archives of the public archives in Fredericton, where those documents are usually petitions for land, Zimri Armstrong's petition is unique in that he is lodging a complaint against white Loyalists. And he had every reason to complain. At the end of the Revolution, the American Revolution, Zimri Armstrong is a free man, but he has a family that's still enslaved. And the only way he sees of looking after himself and securing the freedom of his family is to go into an indenture. And he enters into an indenture with Samuel Jarvis, a loyalist from Connecticut. And Jarvis promises to feed Armstrong, to shelter him, to clothe him, and to give him a trade, and to purchase Armstrong's wife and children and give them their freedom. So this is an amazing offer for only 2 years of Armstrong's time and labor. The Jarvis family ends up going to England because Jarvis thought he was going to be employed by the British government. That falls through, and so they end up going to New Brunswick, where there are a lot of Connecticut Loyalists. But things don't work out for Samuel Jarvis, so he returns to Connecticut. He's had it being a Loyalist. It has not worked out for him. But he leaves Zimri Armstrong behind with his brother John Jarvis, who lives in Kingston. Now, when the indenture comes to an end, Zimri's left empty-handed. He is released from his indenture, but he has not been given a trade. He's got nothing to live on, and his family has not been bought and given their freedom. The worst thing possible happens. Zimri finds out eventually that his family has been found by Samuel Jarvis, but his family was found, bought, and sold into slavery in some other part of the 13 colonies. So Zimri Armstrong is in New Brunswick. His indenture has not been honored. He has not been reunited with his family. He's got more than adequate grounds to lodge a complaint. So he appeals to the New Brunswick government, and he just says, this isn't fair, this isn't right. But he realizes that the New Brunswick government really can't do too much about it. They can't compensate him for the lost 2 years. They can't reclaim his family. So what he asks for land as any other Loyalist would receive. So what this document shows is, besides an indenture gone terribly wrong, it also shows us that Zimri Armstrong considered himself to be like any other Loyalist, and that he too should receive land in New Brunswick. Now, Armstrong somehow survives over the next 6 years in New Brunswick. We don't know what he did when he left his indenture, but he does join those that are bound for Sierra Leone. And like Thomas Peters, he's a man that's frustrated by broken promises. He arrives in Sierra Leone, and within 8 years of being in that colony, he becomes one of the leaders of the Nova Scotia Rebellion. There were 3 men that headed up this rebellion, and what they were rebelling against was the fact that the Sierra Leone Company was still in charge of this colony that was supposed to be led by the Black Loyalists that emigrated there. So there is a Nova Scotia rebellion, and the rebellion is quashed. And at this point, we're not sure what happened to Zimri Armstrong. He may have been among those executed, but what seems to be more likely is that he was among those who were banished from Sierra Leone. And we have no trace of Zimri Armstrong after the autumn of 1800. So we have a man that is completely frustrated, who has had promise upon promise broken. And in the end, rises up against the unfairness of conditions in Sierra Leone, and only to face banishment. So it's hard to say that his experience was a common one, but it's one of the stories that I was able to find in doing research. Now, while Zimri Armstrong's experiences turned him against British government, British rule, that wouldn't be typical. Those who went on to Sierra Leone, by and large, they put up with the conditions that they found there. And one of the most interesting men among those that we know left New Brunswick for Sierra Leone is a man that initially we know as Richard Wheeler. And Richard Wheeler was an immensely determined man. Like, just going through the documents, you get a tremendous sense of his character. He's a man that bought his own freedom from slavery. So we assume that he had a enslaver that allowed him to earn money on the side. And with those wages, he bought his freedom, and he sides with the British as a free black man, and ends up being recognized by the British authorities in New York City as being a leader. And we don't know what exact qualities those were, but he was put in charge of a company of black loyalists, and he was given the title of captain, which was not a military captain, but it meant that he was in charge. And that company of black loyalists included 34 heads of households. They came to New Brunswick on a ship known as the Clinton. And in the Book of Negroes, Richard Wheeler is identified by that name. And Wheeler was the name of his enslaver. But what's interesting as we follow his story through the documents in New Brunswick is that Richard Wheeler slowly reacquires his African name. We find in the victualling musters at Fort Howe, the musters that record the people receiving food and provisions, we find that he styles himself as Richard C. Wheeler. And then later on, in a petition to the New Brunswick government, he calls himself Richard Karankapoon or Karankapone Wheeler. And I'll just pause a moment. We're not 100% sure how his African name should be said. In the documents, we have 6 different spellings for that name. And so it's anyone's guess as to what the correct pronunciation is. Folks at the University of New Brunswick have consulted experts, and they think that name comes from the country that is now known as Ghana. So that may give us a clue as to where Richard originally came from. As time goes by and Richard's name appears on petitions for lands, he completely drops his enslaver's name and is no longer known as Richard Wheeler, but becomes known as Richard Karankapoon. He is one of 16 black loyalists that petitions for land on the Narrapus River. And we have a picture of the Narrapus River on a map from 1787. And in that map, we see reference to Negro settlements. So it is Richard Karankapone, the captain of black loyalists, who is one of 16 that settle along the Narrapus River. So he was successful in getting land from the New Brunswick government. In fact, we actually have a copy of the map that shows the deeds given out to these heads of household. So on the Narrapus River, we have a settlement noticed from 1787. But again, for whatever reason, by 1791, this settlement has not worked out. The land is not fertile, and the settlers that tried to be farmers along the Narrapus, they end up hiring themselves out as laborers. So things are not good. But 4 years later, along comes this opportunity to go to Sierra Leone that Thomas Peters is bringing back to the Black Loyalists of New Brunswick. So Richard Karankapone is one of over 200 people that heads down to St. John and tries to get on a ship bound for Halifax. The trouble is the officials in New Brunswick did not want to lose a cheap source of labor. They did not want to lose the Black Loyalists. And so there was actually action taken in St. John to deny Black Loyalists the opportunity to get on those ships for Sierra Leone. They came up with false indenture saying, oh, you can't go on the ship, you're still an indentured servant. Or they came up with false debt saying, no, you can't leave the colony because you are still in debt. If we could go back to the slide of a birth certificate, this is also something that they asked the Black Loyalists of New Brunswick to show. A birth certificate was a certificate validating the emancipation of a Black Loyalist. It was printed on a small piece of paper, and in St. John, some people were saying, well, show me your birth certificate and we'll let you on the ship. Well, it was a piece of paper. And over 8 years, it's going to weather, it's going to be destroyed, and it may not have been held on to. So there's a real bottleneck. And finally, the ships leave with about 222 people on board. But there are those left behind in New Brunswick who wanted to go to Sierra Leone. Well, Richard Carankapone, who's a man that's demonstrated determination in his earlier history, heads off to Halifax with 4 other Black Loyalists. And when I say head off, he actually walks overland. So try to imagine Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in December, and try to imagine the fact that there are no roads and you are walking overland, which is a distance of about 500 kilometers. It takes 15 days, but Richard Carankapone and his 4 friends finally get to Halifax. They have traversed the Maritimes in December, and they come to the door of John Clarkson, who is the man in charge of organizing the fleet to Sierra Leone. Clarkson is amazed at their story, and he's livid with how the Black Loyalists were treated in St. John. And Clarkson admits that perhaps if he was not in Halifax, the Black Loyalists would have the same difficulty there in leaving for Sierra Leone. Well, Carankapone gets on the ships, one of the 15 ships, and heads off to Freetown. And we have a picture of Freetown Harbor as it looked later on once it was settled. Sierra Leone is named for the Lion Mountains that look like reclining lions, and you can see those in the background. So that's the origin of the name Sierra Leone. When Carankapone gets to Sierra Leone, he is made a constable, the local police force. So again, his leadership is recognized, his authority is recognized. He ends up coming to blows with men that he knew back in New Brunswick. When the Nova Scotia Rebellion flares up in Sierra Leone, one of the men that is on the opposing side is a man that settled next to Carankapone on the Narrapus River in New Brunswick. So sadly, just like the American Revolution divided families, the conflict over who should be in control in Freetown also separates Black Loyalists. And in 1804, while he's fighting against fellow Black Loyalists in Freetown, Richard Carankapone is killed in defending the authority of those in charge in Freetown. So at 58 years of age, he dies. We don't know if Carankapone had a wife and children. Sadly, in most historical records, a man's wife and children do not get mentioned. So we're left wondering what happened to them. So I see Carankapone as an example of what New Brunswick lost. We have here a man who is a capable leader, very determined, as Thomas Peters was, and it's someone that could have contributed so much to early New Brunswick society. What's interesting is that in the last few years, there is now a lake near Grand Bay, Westfield, that has been named in honor of Richard Carankapone. So on this side of the Atlantic, we are remembering a man who had a remarkable determination, and a man that sadly was frustrated with New Brunswick to the point of moving on to Sierra Leone. Now, one of the questions that I often get asked about the book is, why did I only spotlight 8 Black Loyalists in the book? Well, Thomas Peters had to be spotlighted. He's the most famous of all. The other 7 Black Loyalists that are mentioned in my books are not to be found. Their stories are not to be found anywhere else. they were the only stories that I could find. I've been searching over the last 14 years for stories of Black Loyalists in New Brunswick, and have been able to piece together the other 7 stories that are found in the book. I was very privileged to be part of a group of historians gathered by the University of New Brunswick back in 2008, and was able to contribute 3 of the stories in my book to that website. So the website created by the University of New Brunswick back in 2008 contains 3 of the stories that are in my book. But since then, I've found other worthy Black Loyalists, and I have found more of the stories that were initially featured on that website with the University of New Brunswick. The stories that are featured in the book are stories that were initially found in an online newsletter known as Loyalist Trails. And I was able to piece those stories together using resources that people can access online. So if there are those that want to find out more about Black Loyalist history, that are trying to track down family histories, I can recommend some resources to them. Newspapers from the first 50 years of settlement in New Brunswick can be found online at the public archives in Fredericton, and can be accessed that way. Christening records have now become available for a number of Anglican churches in New Brunswick, and again, they can be found online. The Mary Audie collection is one. The probate records for New Brunswick that show the wills of Black Loyalists, and that show the wills of white Loyalists that bequeathed Black slaves, are also found at the public archives in Fredericton. The victualling musters that record the names of those who received food from Fort Howe in St. John in the early years of Loyalist settlement are found in a remarkable book composed by David Bell. And that book also has some partial lists of passengers on Loyalist evacuation vessels. Petitions written by men such as Thomas Peters, Zimri Armstrong, and others mentioned, can be found once again online in the public archives website. And the mother lode for Loyalist research is the Book of Negroes, which lists over 2,000 names of Black Loyalists who came to New Brunswick. The thing that people need to remember is that for every name in the Book of Negroes, there are probably 3 others who came to New Brunswick, came to Nova Scotia, that are not listed there as Black Loyalists. The Book of Negroes is not a complete list of all Black Loyalists who came to our region. So people may say, I know my ancestors are Black Loyalists, I can't find them in the Book of Negroes, and the reason may be is that they came at a different time, in a different way, in private ships, rather than ships that were commissioned by the British government. So those are starting points for those that want to research Black Loyalist history. Also, the correspondence of prominent Loyalists often mentions either a Black Loyalist or enslaved Blacks. When it comes to the trip to Sierra Leone, John Clarkson kept a journal, and this can also be found online. And that's where we get the remarkable story of Richard Carancapone and his 4 friends that trekked overland to get to Halifax. The one thing that I have not been able to access, because I access resources online, is that oral tradition that is held within the descendants of Black Loyalists and within the Black communities of New Brunswick. And so it's my hope that people will come forward and start to record those stories, because that will add to the tapestry of Black Loyalist research.
That's fascinating information, Stephen. Well, thank you for. Now, do you have anything else you'd like to tell us, or are you? Can I ask you some questions?
There's a few things that it'd be good to raise, and I mentioned this in the introduction to my book, is that New Brunswick is unique in that it offered an alternative to the history that eventually unfolded within the province. When Loyalists came to New Brunswick, there were sort of two utopian views, if you will. Within the white Loyalist community, they were bound and determined to show that New Brunswick was going to be better than anything in the United States. The white Loyalists wanted to say that New Brunswick would be the envy of the United States. And they gave the new colony the motto, hope restored, that things were going to be better. That was one view. Sadly, that view was very much a class-based society, and it was one that was a racist society. But that was one utopian view of New Brunswick. The other one is the view of the folks that settled in Beaver Harbor. And those were Quakers and Baptists who, before they left New York City, said, we're going to establish a settlement along the coast of the Bay of Fundy, and it is going to be slave-free. We will not admit slave owners to our community. And when those Quakers and Baptists settled in Beaver Harbor, they brought Black Loyalists with them. And sadly, we do not have the names of those Black Loyalists because they would be fascinating to know who those people were. But for a few years, what we had in New Brunswick was a community where whites and blacks were treated equally, where all blacks represented in the community were free men and women. And we had this alternate version of what could have been in New Brunswick. Now, sadly, there was a fire, and it absolutely devastated Beaver Harbor, and the population scattered. But what that means is that there were Black Loyalists who found employment in other parts of the colony, who settled in other parts of New Brunswick, who remembered what it was like. They had been part of a very different community. And what the sad aspect of this is that New Brunswick had a chance to do it differently. And there were those who remembered what it was like to have a community where men and women were treated as equals, and that fell through. But it is something that we are slowly reclaiming as part of New Brunswick history. The folks in Beaver Harbor are starting to recognize that the founders of that area had a very different vision for New Brunswick.
Again, fascinating information, Stephen, and we're all appreciative of the work that you and other historians have done to bring this information to light. It really is truly fascinating. So I have a few questions for you. Are you ready to field a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. Now, this is a bit of an older one, going back to Cairo, but this is from Mona, and she asked, could it be that the person freed was younger and Cairo was older?
He was male. I don't know if that was it. It's a sexist society. I have no idea, but it's I don't think, if he valued the service that Cairo had rendered over decades, to me, he should have set her free. She had a husband. It's not as if if she'd been a widow, a single woman, setting her free, would have, basically made her a homeless person. But
right.
She had a husband. I just don't think he had any excuse for not setting her free.
Okay. Thank you very much for asking that. Another question for you. Did Black Loyalists get the same size plots of land that white Loyalists got?
I haven't found anything that said that they were dissatisfied with what they got. It depended on who you were, even as a white Loyalist. Mm-hmm. If you were in the army, you received one. If you were a veteran, you received one size of lot. If you were an officer, you received more. People were frustrated generally with the whole land distribution. The white Loyalists didn't like it any more than the Black Loyalists did. It's just that generally the Black Loyalists were put in marginal lands.
Okay.
So they definitely were not given a fair shake when it came to Nova Scotia. With New Brunswick, the fact that these settlements along the Belle Isle, along the Narrapus, that they failed, mm-hmm. strikes me that, okay, the New Brunswick government didn't really look to find the best, land for them.
The land was pretty much untillable, right?
Yes,
Rocks.
that's what seems, from the documents that we have. But it's very sad because in the petitions, the Black Loyalists say, we want to earn a living, we want to be contributing citizens, we want to, we don't want to be layabouts, we want to be workers. So they had a tremendous desire to be contributing members to society, and it's it is no fault of their own that didn't happen in New Brunswick.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying there. They're just kind of victims of the pervasive sort of racism at the time. Stephen, we have a question from Jennifer here. She wants to know how you did. She says there have been several Black Loyalist histories written and researched over the years, and how do you determine which Black Loyalist histories would be worthy for research?
You mean which authority should you trust? Cassandra Pyrubus from Australia is one person that's done a lot of remarkable. And again, interesting, isn't it, that the people in Australia wanted to track this. Maya Jasanoff's book, Liberty's Exiles, is a wonderful overview.
Okay.
Harvey Amani Whitfield did an amazing book. It's the gold standard on slavery in New Brunswick.
Right.
There have not been a lot of books on Black Loyalists. There's a book, I'm going to forget her name now, wrote a book about, let's see, I'm trying to see if I can quickly lay my fingers on it. Wrote a book about Black Loyalists from the South that settled in Nova Scotia. And she's done an excellent job there. And I'm sorry, the name's not coming up right now. She's a university professor in Halifax.
I'm sure it's something people can Google.
Yeah. Now my research is I've always the 7 people that are featured outside of Thomas Peters in this book were not known widely. Their stories were jigsaw pieces hidden in primary documents and had to be brought together. As I illustrated with the story of Pompeii and Cairo, it was 4 little fragments scattered that I brought together to tell the story, and that's how I have done my work is combing through the primary documents to try to flesh out these people. So my work has been not so much leaning on the shoulders of those who have done amazing work, but to try to find new stories in the primary sources.
Which of course is great. You're using the primary documents and various sources to get more information and sort of move the whole idea of researching Loyalist and Black people from this time along, which is brilliant. Just a few more questions for you, Stephen. Given the racism of the late 18th century, was it unrealistic for Black Loyalists to have expectations that they'd be treated with equality when they got to New Brunswick?
Well, I mean, they were given hope when they were given their freedom by the British. I mean, this was amazing. Like that a world empire would offer freedom, to enslaved people. Again, only enslaved by patriots, but nevertheless, this was an amazing step. And they were given all the rights and privileges of free men and women during the American Revolution. So, having been given those, and having the British government side with them, like at the end of the Revolution, in the peace treaty, the Americans asked for all of their property to be returned. And Black Loyalists in New York City at the time were just paralyzed with fear that this would actually happen, that the British would turn over all the Black Loyalists back to their masters. And masters were in New York City kidnapping, recapturing Black Loyalists. And Sir Guy Carleton, Pompey's employer, he just felt it was a matter of honor that if the British government had promised freedom to Black Loyalists, they should honor that promise. And so, at risk of dismantling the peace treaty and continuing the American Revolution, Sir Guy Carleton says no. If by the time that the preliminary treaty was drafted, if someone had crossed British lines, we're going to count them as free people. They are no longer the property of patriots. So as long as a black man or woman had crossed the British lines by December of 1782,
Mm-hmm.
they were protected by the British government. So we have, in the back of Black Loyalist minds, we have the fact that the British Empire freed them, that at risk of the whole peace process, they said, no, we are going to maintain their freedom. It strikes me that the Black Loyalists, it was reasonable that they'd expect that they would be, treated as equals when they reached the Maritimes.
Sure.
And again, what I found in reading the documents of the era is that it was an expectation. Like they talked about themselves as being fellow loyalists. They reminded the lieutenant governor of their service to the crown in their petitions. They were getting their food and provisions at Fort Howe shoulder to shoulder with white loyalists.
Yes.
So everything would lead them to believe that it's going to be different in New Brunswick, and sadly, it wasn't.
It's fascinating that you mention all that you just mentioned, Stephen, because we had historian Graham Nickerson on yesterday who pretty much ran down the exact same thing you ran down about the agreement at the end, near the end of the Revolution, where the Americans said they wanted their property back, and Carleton saying, no, we're actually not going to do that, and any blacks that came over to our lines in New York City would be considered British and thus free. And we talked about that, and the fact that Fort Howe was used as a distribution center for all the loyalists here in New Brunswick. So again, just fascinating how it all sort of ties together. Final question for you. What options, now I know we talked about either staying or leaving, but were there any other options that the New Brunswick's black loyalists had when their dreams of being treated with equality were sort of dashed when they got to Canada?
Yeah. Well, when Thomas Peters came back from England, there were actually two other options besides the Sierra Leone one. One of those was that black loyalists could go to the West Indies and serve in a regiment down there, and be given land in the West Indies. No one seems to have taken them up on that option. That didn't seem to be a popular one at all. The other one was that the British government, having wrapped the knuckles of both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick's lieutenant governors, wanted the whole land issue settled and wanted to make sure that the blacks received the land that they were due. I have not come across anything that said that those who decided to remain in New Brunswick were given more land. They may have been, but I just haven't found that in the documents.
Okay.
So that's what happened in 1791. The three options of West Indies, Sierra Leone, or better land grants. I do not know if blacks took up on this, but this was an option for white loyalists. White loyalists were frustrated with New Brunswick, and when John Graves Simcoe became the lieutenant governor of what is now Ontario, he welcomed loyalists from New Brunswick to come and populate Upper Canada, Ontario. And it was actually referred to as Niagara fever in New Brunswick at the time.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, people going, hey, let's go to Upper Canada. So it wouldn't surprise me if black loyalists took up that option as well, because there were black loyalist settlements in that area of Ontario, in the Niagara region.
Right.
They may have been black loyalists that went overland from New York into Upper Canada and settled there. But other than risking re-enslavement or returning to the United States, those were the options that black loyalists had.
That's fascinating, because I never knew. I mean, we certainly obviously knew that other parts of Canada were places that blacks went to from enslavement in the United States, but I never knew about Niagara fever at all. Never knew about that. So that's the fascinating history. And
there was a black community in Montreal. I just finished reading an amazing book by Fred Mackey called Black Then, and it chronicles the first 100 years of blacks in Montreal. And again, the first ones to settle in Montreal as free men and women were black loyalists. Some went there by ship from New York. Others went overland through New York State to get to Montreal. So there are pockets, but we know the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, that is the heartland, if you will, of black loyalists in New Brunswick.
Right.
In Canada, sorry.
Would it be? Would it be correct to call it sort of sort of the heart of Black Canada, kind of the origin of Afro Canada, Afro Canadians?
Yeah, this is one of the things I point out in the book, is that this is the first time that we have free Black men and women living alongside white men and women in North America, and so there's this amazing social experiment going on in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick at this time.
Mm-hmm.
White society failed the test, but it is the beginning of the free Black experience, free Black history in Canada. Up until that time, if there is a Black in what we know as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia today, if they were a part of the population, they were someone that was enslaved.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So
because
this is ground zero for free Black Canadian history.
Because, and as you've probably said in the past, it was Nova Scotia and Quebec, I believe, and of course New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia back then, were the only two Canadian provinces that allowed slavery. Is that correct?
Well, it was allowed throughout the British Empire. So wherever the Queen Anne's flag is flying at this time, slavery is permitted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So sadly, it was just everywhere.
Yeah, definitely pervasive. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, listen, what I want to do is I want to thank you very much for your very informative talk. I've enjoyed it both days. We learned a lot, and I'm fairly certain our audience did too. I want to thank you for agreeing to be with us twice this week. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in and posing some really great questions. I want to remind everybody that the speaker series continues tomorrow. We're going to be interviewing Joe G., who's going to be talking about the Underground Railroad here in New Brunswick. The Underground Railroad does have a terminus, one of many in Canada, in the province of New Brunswick. And Joe G. is going to be talking about that tomorrow at 2 p.m. So that's Saturday, February 20th at 2 p.m. We're going to be talking about the Underground Railroad here in New Brunswick. Stephen, again, I want to thank you for your time and your information. Loved it. And our audience, I want to thank you again for tuning in. Be well, and we will see you tomorrow.